One thing that perplexes me about the times we're living in is why you can be transgender but not transracial, transabled, transspecies, etc. And what do I mean by this? Well, if you can change your gender at will, let's just take another one. Why can't you change your race? I've heard attempted arguments as to why you could do one but not the other. For instance, people will say gender is purely social or psychological while race is purely physical, ergo, it's not the same thing. But if gender was purely social or psychological, why are people applying so many physical changes to their bodies in order to align with the gender that they feel inside? Taking sex hormones, mastectomies, inverting their Johnsons, whatever it might be. Why apply all those physical changes to the body if it's just psychological in nature? I also remember seeing an article saying that there was something to do with the way people's braids looked that might indicate gender identity earlier in life. And this was actually used as an argument to show that gender identity has some basis in biology, but then that destroys the dichotomy that gender is purely social in nature and race is purely physical, because then you obviously do have a physical component. And likewise, race is just not purely physical because, well, minus the fact that there's obviously a psychological component, since racial dysphoria exists, since transracial people exist because they think they're a race that uh, other than the one that they're born into. So there's obviously a psychological component there. But pushing all that aside, you also have this whole thing called racial identity. You have the race's culture, the race's politics, etc., its backstory, its history. I mean, I'm pretty sure people would not just be limiting to the amount of melanin produced on their skin when they talk about what it means to be black, what it means to be Latino, what it means to be Asian, etc. So this whole thing about gender being purely psychological or social while race is purely physical, it's a false dichotomy. It's a vast oversimplification of how complex the issue can really be, and which is kind of ironic because the people on the left are always talking about how nuanced gender can be, how much of a spectrum it can be instead of a binary, how complex it can be. Another reason I've heard is that, oh, when it comes to gender, you can just take off the dress at the end of the day, but when it comes to race, you can't take off your skin color. Now, this also doesn't work because being transgender is so much more than just cross dressing. I mean, if you're a cross dresser, that's one thing. That doesn't necessarily imply you're transracial, because once you start taking those hormones, you've been taking them for a long time. You can't just willy nilly yourself off of them and expect everything to go back to normal. I've heard many leftists say that there's no consequences, that there's completely reversible. But you see these videos on YouTube of people regretting their transitions, especially if it's like female to male, and then they end up stopping after taking testosterone for a while. They have permanent hair loss, their voice is permanently lower, etc. And I'm sure there's others that I don't quite remember, and I'm sure there's consequences from men transitioning to women and taking too much estrogen. So it's not completely reversible, and then likewise, it's not a cane to just take it off the dress at the end of the day, because once you have all those chemicals in your bodies, or you've already got a mastectomy, or so you did some other physical changes to your body, you obviously can't go back from that. And technically, about the whole not being able to change your skin color, I mean, most of the time you can't, but you can bleach your skin, and that's how transracial people often make the leap to their new desired race. I mean, Michael Jackson did it a long time ago. Nobody said a word. So obviously it's possible. But that aside, a third reason I've heard is what was I going to say here? You might potentially offend people of the race to which you're transitioning to. Like, if there was that one dude who transitioned to a South Korean, and a lot of Koreans on the comment section of the video I saw that was critiquing it said they were offended, saying, "Oh, you don't know what it means to be a Korean. You have no idea. You didn't grow up in the culture. You didn't have that upbringing, those 20 years, that childhood of, you know, just growing up in that country, what it truly means to be a Korean. You'll never completely understand." But a lot of people, I mean, I've specifically seen women say that men who transition into women still aren't women because they didn't grow up as women. They're never completely understand what it means to be a woman, because it's so much more than just the biology and stuff like that, so much more than just the typical masculine and feminine characteristics. When you're raised as a man, you're raised a certain way. When you're raised as a woman, you're raised a certain way, etc. And they don't have that upbringing, that experience, that years of that culture influence on them, and everything that comprises what it means to be a woman. And they don't have that years of interaction with between female peers and stuff like that. They didn't develop all those social dynamics. And there's a lot more to it. I'm not a woman, so I obviously can't speak on that very well. I'm sure a lot of other women could. But my point being is, they say these men are erasing women in a way, and they get offended when the men transition into women. And this, to me, essentially looks like the same thing as those Koreans getting offended as when the white dude transitions into a Korean dude. But the irony of it is, here is the latter is in silence, but the former is. The former is called TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminist, I believe they're called. And they're attempted to be silenced despite getting the fact that they're offended. They're called transphobes, etc. Meanwhile, the people who are trying to, that dude who is trying to transition to the race, and those Koreans who are offended, I mean, ironically, you could kind of apply the word transphobe here to the Koreans, because it's another kind of trans, but they're not labeled as that. Leftists take their side, etc. While in the other scenario, leftists would be against the women who are speaking out against the men transitioning into becoming a woman. So I see a lack of a parallel there. That to me is not a valid reason as well. So anybody else that comes across this video and you've heard these three things, you've heard my rebuttals to them. If you don't agree with them, tell me why, or can you please give me a rational reason as to why racial dysphoria is not accepted, but gender dysphoria is. And it's the same thing, transabled, people who identify as disabled. There actually is a disorder where people feel like maybe their arm is not a part of their body and they want it chopped off. And interestingly enough, some of them even get sexually aroused by this thought. Forget what the identity disorder is called, but we'll just call it transabled for short. I mean, they might choose to identify as disabled if they have this body dysmorphia of this kind. Or I've seen videos of trans species people where they claim to identify as foxes, squirrels, wolves, etc. And the irony of it here is, this seems to be more socially acceptable than the transracial thing, which I don't understand how, but that to me at least it seems to be that way. And I've also come across articles of teachers saying they were silenced when a kid wanted to identify as another animal in class, and the teacher told them no, that's ridiculous, but they were silenced for it. I don't know if that part is true or not. You can't tell what is and what isn't satire these days, so don't quote me on that. But it would not surprise me if that was the case. And then, of course, you got, I mean, if trans-aged people, is that technically the term for it? Where people could potentially identify as another age. The list goes on. And I think one reason why leftists only want to allow gender and not all the others is because they know they've opened up quite a bad can of worms here. They know they've had, I mean, they can't even define what a woman is half the time. They know with gender and, the whole controversial thing of being in the opposite bathroom when it could potentially be a sexual predator, or trans women competing in women's sports, etc. And there's all these problems that go along with it, and so many ambiguities and stuff like that. They know they've opened a bad can of worms, and as such, they don't want to allow anything else with race, because then the question is, could you claim affirmative action if you are transracial? If you're identifying as another age, could you vote or get your license before you're 18, or whatever the age restriction is? Could you drink before you're 21, at least in America, etc.? They know that, well, slippery slope is a logical fallacy, but in this particular case, it is an issue. They know that a whole avalanche of shit could come tumbling down, and it could open so many doors to manipulating the system in so many ways. And I think that's also another reason why they want to keep it as transgender. But to wrap up this video, I've always just been perplexed as to why one's been allowed and the other isn't. I mean, they all obviously have physical and psychological / social components to them, and They were all before DSM-4 was took transgender before DSM-5 took transgender out of the entry because of political reasons, not because of mental disorder classification. And DSM-4 and back, you had racial dysphoria right next to gender dysphoria, right next to species dysphoria, etc. Why do we permit one but not the rest? Is it simply because they know what can of worms they could potentially open up? Because I've yet to hear a rational reason, and this to me, when it seems as spread out as it is, as prevalent as it is, you should be able to justify it. And so far, I've seen that none of the radical leftists can. And it's, to me, it honestly looks like the religious right tried to justify the religion and tripping over their own shoelaces again and again, just on the opposite side of the spectrum and with different content. But to me, it kind of looks like the same pathetic attempts to justify it when they can. So if there's any other reason, if you made it this far in the video, if there's any other reason you can think of as to why you can identify as another gender but not another race, species, etc., or why it's not as socially acceptable for the others as it is for gender, let me know, because I've been waiting a long time to hear a rational reason. It was something this proliferate, so to speak. I think they should have one.